So in this section, we'll be talking about some environmental policies, so some government policies that attempt to minimize the negative effects of externalities. So there's several different types of policies that we'll discuss. There's three. The first one is command and control policies. Well, this type of policy, it basically mandates all producers of a certain type of pollution to take specific steps to reduce that pollution. It applies to all producers equally. Everyone has to do the same thing, and it's a mandatory policy. So some examples could be installing pollution reducing technologies, like some kind of water filter or air filter on equipment. These could be limits to the amount of fertilizer that you're allowed to use, or making you build a retention pond to capture water runoff that contains sediment and nutrients or pesticides. So these are command and control policies. They are mandatory and they apply to everybody. Now, there are some issues with these type of policies. While sometimes we do just have to say, no, absolutely not, they are kind of one size fits all policies that don't necessarily work for everyone. So kind of like we talked about in the case study of the water use with corn and cotton, these are one size fits all, and making changes can be really expensive for some farmers, but totally doable for other farmers. So we know that every business is different. So for example, some farms might run a tractor 2,000 plus hours a year. And that's generally how we talk about use of equipment. We talk about it in use hours instead of like miles that we drive the tractor like we do our cars. So some farms may use a tractor for 2,000 plus hours a year, while others only use them for 200 hours a year. So if you were to have some kind of mandate that said farms must use tractors that have this kind of fuel efficiency or this kind of emissions reduction, it might have a great impact on that farm that's using their tractor 2,000 hours a year. Like the reduction in pollution from that would be really big, but it wouldn't be so big for the farm that only runs their tractor 200 hours a year. And it might be an expense that that farmer can't afford. So mandating the same thing for businesses that are designed differently and operate differently can have a variable effect, and it can harm farmers while not necessarily having the intended policy outcome. So it can be wasteful and unfair. Another type of policy is our taxes and subsidies. So these are what we call incentive-based approaches. So we are giving businesses an incentive to reduce their pollution. This is usually either through putting a tax on pollution. So producers would have to pay a certain amount of money for every unit of pollution that they create. And this makes pollution expensive. So producers have a good reason to cut back. And then you could have subsidies on abatement. So government payments for reducing the amount of pollution that you produce. Now, some businesses may reduce pollution by a lot to take advantage of those government payments, but others might not be able to reduce their pollution very much, so they may only cut back a little or not at all. So this leaves the decision on whether to reduce pollution up to the business. It depends on whether or not it makes financial sense for them. Now, the third type of policy is called a cap and trade policy. Let me move my little face here. You can see a cap and trade policy, or transferable pollution permits. So this is when the government decides on a cap on total pollution. So they say that for all industries, we only want, let's say, X amount of carbon dioxide to be produced. So they take that amount, that total amount of pollution that they don't want to go above, and they divide it amongst businesses by giving them permits to pollute a certain amount. So the point with this is that a business could either just go about their business as normal and pollute at or below the level that their permit allows them to, or they could reduce their pollution and then sell their extra permits to another business that doesn't want to or can't reduce their amount of pollution. So this kind of strategy allows the market to decide who should reduce pollution, who it's most financially feasible for and easiest for to reduce pollution, rather than leaving it to the government to guess and say, you get to pollute this much, you get to pollute this much, and you get to pollute this much. It allows businesses to trade with their ability to create pollution. So those are cap and trade policies, setting a total cap on the amount of a pollution and then dividing it up between businesses and kind of allowing the businesses themselves to decide whether to cut back their pollution or not. So let's talk about a few examples of these kinds of policies that are in action. So in 2014, the state of California passed an act called the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, or SGMA. Now, this has been a very hot topic in agriculture in California for the last 10 plus years. And basically, this act mandated existing local agencies like water agencies to form what they called GSAs, or groundwater sustainability agencies. And they said that these agencies must create sustainable management plans for groundwater in their region. And they have to decide how that's best done. They have to decide what their goals are. And the goals have to meet what SGMA says that they need to do, the amount of either reduction of groundwater use or reduction in pollution of groundwater sources. They have to meet those goals, but they get to decide what is best for their region on how they are going to meet those goals. So the GSAs design and decide on the policies that are actually used to reduce the groundwater use. So for example, Pajaro Valley Water Management Agency, which is in a heavily agriculture, or we should say an area that relies heavily on agriculture, and most of the land in Pajaro Valley is agricultural land. They offer rebates on water saving technologies. So they offer incentives for farmers to adopt water saving technologies. They'll pay them back for them. They will offer them free counsel, free advice on how to reduce their water use and how best to improve their water efficiency. So that's one type of policy example. And this is more of an incentive type of policy. Then we have a cap and trade program from the California Air Resources Board. So this program, it aims to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and it applies to 80% of the greenhouse gas emissions in the United States. So 80% of the greenhouse gas pollution that's going on falls under this cap and trade program. So in the program, just like we talked about, air pollution permits are issued to businesses every year, and the businesses get to decide, do we want to reduce our amount of greenhouse gas emissions and sell our excess permits to another business or not? And every year with this program, it's not the case for every cap and trade program, but for this program, every year they issue fewer and fewer permits. So they have a goal, I think it's by 2046 or something like that. They want a very, very minimal amount of greenhouse gas emissions to be coming from these industries. So every year we reduce the amount of permits, but we still allow those companies to trade their permits amongst each other. Then we have the Endangered Species Act. So this one has been around for a little while, and it kind of came out of logging, which is technically an agricultural pursuit. And it is a command and control policy. It is an absolutely not put the foot down kind of policy. It has been changed a little bit since its inception, and unfortunately, those changes have made it easier for people to find loopholes and to get around it. But essentially, the Endangered Species Act makes it illegal to harass, harm, pursue, hunt, shoot, wound, kill, catch, capture, or collect any endangered species, no matter who you are and no matter what land you're on or who the land belongs to. So it severely restricts activities on which these endangered species are found. So oftentimes these areas where we find endangered species, they do not allow any logging, they do not allow any agriculture. Sometimes you can work, depending on what the species is that they found, you can work with them to both provide conservation habitat and do whatever economic activity you intend to do with the land. But this can be really hard for landowners. Now, I am a fan of the Endangered Species Act. I think it's very important to protect our biodiversity, but there's an issue with this policy. And the main issue is that it offers no incentives for conservation. So it actually punishes landowners who happen to find endangered species on their land because it means that they cannot conduct the economic activities that they had intended to. So sometimes what happens is that an endangered species is found by a landowner or by a surveyor, and the landowner decides that the best thing to do is to get rid of it. So they call this the shoot, shovel, and shut up method. So they're basically getting around this Endangered Species Act by getting rid of these species that existed there and then pretending that they never existed there. So it can actually drive harm to endangered species. So I would love to see this act reimagined and reinstituted with incentives for conservation rather than just punishment for not performing any conservation. Okay, this is our last section, agriculture and human health outcomes. And this is a heavy one. I mean, I feel like this whole week, there's a lot of negative stuff going on here, but there's also a lot of exciting things going on. And if you are interested at all in social justice and in human health, then agriculture is a great place to put your time and your energy if you want to make a difference in the world. So yeah, let's get into this human health component. So whose health are we talking about? Well, obviously we're talking about agricultural workers' health, right? We probably realize that agricultural workers have very high rates of exposure to pesticides and often unsafe working conditions. We're also talking about consumers' health. So there is pesticide residue on most of our food. Whether or not those pesticides are harmful to humans is not really that well understood yet. They haven't been around long enough to be studied, and we know too little about the human microbiome, all of the microbiology that lives in our bodies, to know how pesticides affect them. So we also have the nutritional quality of food, which we know has declined since the intensification of agriculture. That food coming out of factory farms tends to be of lower nutritional quality than food grown in organic or more traditional methods. And then we have the bigger picture. So the health of the public, and that pertains to air quality, water quality, and a big one right now is resistance to antibiotics. So we'll talk about that one specifically because it's an interesting one and one that not a ton of people are that aware of, but should be. So first of all, let's talk about the cost of our industrialized food system to public health. So in 2019, the Harvard School of Public Health did this study, and they found that 20% of the medical costs in the United States were related to unhealthy diets. So you guys probably know, but Americans do not have the best diets. We have a lot of processed food. We have a lot of highly processed carbohydrates coming from wheat and corn. And we tend not to eat that many vegetables, and we tend to eat poor quality food. So this all has a cost, and that cost shows up in our medical bills and the stress on our health system. In 2019, they estimated that these medical costs due to diet-related diseases cost us about $50 billion a year. Now they're looking at about $1.1 trillion a year. $1.1 trillion a year in healthcare from eating poorly. That's as much as we spend on food every year as a nation. And then plus we've got about 600,000 deaths every year from diet-related disease. So coming back to this true cost accounting graph that we looked at earlier, you can see the human health cost is equal to our actual expenditure on food. So something is very broken here. And the poor quality of food, poor quality of nutrition, it affects many people in this country. So kind of an overview of some of the human health issues that are associated with agriculture. Exposure to agrochemicals. This is both for agricultural workers and for everybody else because we eat food, and some of us live in communities that are close to agricultural areas. Another issue is access to nutritious foods. It's easy to forget for some of us living on the West Coast where we grow a lot of fresh fruits and vegetables, that's not the case for every community. Many communities do not have access to affordable or nutritious foods. And these are areas that are referred to as food deserts. Now, you might hear this word quite a bit if you continue to study anything to do with social justice and food or agriculture. But food deserts, areas where there's little to no access to affordable or nutritious food. Now, I had heard about these and I had studied them in school, but I had not really experienced them until, I'll tell you guys a little story here. So until a few years ago, I rode my bike across the country from the East Coast to the West Coast. Now, I had never spent any time in the middle of the country. And we spent weeks riding through these areas with just corn for as far as you could see, or just wheat for as far as you could see. These are huge, huge farms in what we call the grain belt area, where we grow all of these commodity crops in the Midwest. Now, you could tell, when passing through these towns, you could tell that they used to be something. But now they're full of abandoned buildings, and maybe there's a few people living there. There's a couple farmers, but this consolidation of farms that we talked about, we have fewer larger farms, which means that a lot of people had to leave these communities to find other opportunities. And so you have very small communities that can no longer support a grocery store or access to other resources that they might need. And so for many people that I spoke with, it's an hour drive to go get groceries. Maybe there's a Dollar General here or there. I ate out of a Dollar General nearly every day for weeks because that's all that there was. And you know what the quality of the food at a Dollar General is? It's pretty damn poor. Sometimes you might find an apple or a banana, but for the most part, we're talking processed foods, rice-a-roni, just very poor quality foods. And this is the reality for a lot of Americans. And it's not just in the middle of the country. These can be urban too. You may live in an urban area where the local corner grocery store could no longer cut it and compete with the big boys a mile away. But if you don't have a car, you can't get to that store that's a mile away. So even though you're in an urban area surrounded by people and stores, you could still be in a food desert. So it's probably not a surprise to you that food deserts and impoverished areas are very closely correlated. So if we look at these two charts, this one on the right shows us the percentage of the population in various states that live in a food desert. So you can see Mississippi, we've got almost 30% of the population living without access to nutritious and affordable foods. This chart on the left, this shows us the 10 poorest states in the United States. So let's see what kind of overlap we can find. We've got Mississippi here on our food desert map. That's the highest amount of the population living in a food desert. They're at 18% of their citizens living below the poverty level. And then we've got New Mexico. They're over here. They've got 17.8% of people living below poverty level. We've got Arkansas. Yep, there they are, 15.7%. Louisiana, where are they? They're here, 18.9%. Highest rate of poverty in the US outside of Puerto Rico. So that's pretty self-explanatory. The lower your income bracket, the less likely you are to have access to affordable and nutritious food. Now, this is obviously a huge issue. And if you are passionate about food and social justice, dive into this, get into this. This might be your calling, your thing. So some other human health issues, CAFOs. So CAFO, that stands for Concentrated Animal Feeding Operation. So if you have ever driven through like Stockton or Bakersfield, if you've ever driven down I-5 towards LA past Harris Ranch, you know what a CAFO is and you know what it smells like. It's that area where you roll up the car windows and you put the air recirculator on in your car because it smells horrific. It smells absolutely awful. I mean, it's just animals living in very tightly confined spaces, standing in their own shit all day. So those are CAFOs, and they do have impacts on community health and welfare. So first of all, people don't want to live near this. When a CAFO comes around and they set up shop, the property values of that area decline tremendously. People don't want to live there. They move away. The people who can't afford to move are left there. And as all the people move away, the resources move away, and the people who are left there have fewer resources. They end up living in food deserts, and that has impact on their health. And then we also have air quality concerns from the dust that's created, from the nitrous oxides that are created, and from methane. So another animal related, where can I put myself? I'm just going to minimize myself, put me over here. Another animal related issue with human health is that of antibiotic resistance. So bacteria that are resistant to our antibiotic drugs. And how this happens, well, first of all, why do we use antibiotics in livestock? Well, one reason is pretty straightforward. It's that just like us, sometimes animals get sick and we have to treat them with an antibiotic to get rid of an infection. But most antibiotic use in livestock is not to treat infections. Mostly it is used to increase the size and the growth rate of animals. So they found out a while ago that giving livestock a low dose of antibiotics over a long period of time caused them to grow to larger body size faster. So it's a way to make more money faster. So what happens is we give these antibiotics, which are not necessary, to livestock, and the antibiotics kill almost all the bacteria, but there's always going to be a certain amount that have some kind of genetic resistance to this antibiotic. And then those that do have the resistance, they multiply. And now you have more and more bacteria that have this resistance that antibiotics don't affect. And these resistant bacteria, they can spread to foods that we then consume, and we get sick with infections from these resistant bacteria. Now, if the bacteria are resistant to the antibiotic type that a doctor prescribes you, the medication is not going to be effective, right? So you can end up with these very serious resistant infections for bacteria that cannot be treated with antibiotics. Now, there is a big push to remove medically important antibiotics, so the types of antibiotics that doctors prescribe us for infections, to remove their use from the livestock industry. Now, California has done this. It passed unanimously that we should not be using medically important antibiotics in livestock. But in other parts of the country, it's still meeting a lot of resistance from the livestock industry. Just another fact, about 70% of antibiotics that are used in the US are used on livestock and not on people. So this is a potentially very serious externality of animal agriculture. Okay, now some of you might be familiar with this. In fact, I think a couple of you have brought it up in your discussions. But let's look at a case study really quick. So Driscoll's, our local berry company, they are the world's largest berry company. They produce 2/3 of all berries worldwide. Now, their world headquarters is here. It's in Watsonville area, and but they produce berries all over the world. They contract with growers all over the place. And their business is structured so that Driscoll's is not actually the one growing the berries. They use independent contract growers. So what that means is that they sign a contract with a farmer that says, we will give you all of your plants because we want you to use the plants that we have bred. We'll give you all your plants. We will give you your inputs. We'll give you your pesticides. We'll tell you how to use them. And we will basically give you the blueprint of how we want you to produce these berries. And then at the end of the season, we will buy all your berries and we distribute them. Now that's their business structure. So they're not growing berries themselves. They're contracting with growers. Now, there's increasing concern in the Watsonville and Pajaro Valley area that pesticide use is, how do we say this? That schools where our children go to school, many of these schools in the Watsonville area and Pajaro Valley are surrounded by or bordered by agricultural land. And a lot of that land is belongs to Driscoll's growers. Now, most of it, you can see from this map, these red areas, these are conventional growers, so they're applying pesticides. The green ones are organic, so they still apply pesticides, but not the really toxic ones. So there's growing concern about this for obvious reasons. We don't want our children being exposed to these kinds of pesticides. In the Pajaro Valley School District alone, 632,000 pounds of pesticides have been applied that are carcinogenic gases. Now, we know that they are carcinogens, they cause cancer, and they are applied in the form of gas. They're a soil fumigant to get rid of disease in the soil. And we talked earlier about the fact that gases can travel for miles. So we know that they are not just staying in the fields, they are drifting right by these schools, and we're exposing our kids to these carcinogens. So there's a lot of resistance to this. The community has come forth many times to ask Driscoll's to transition the fields that are next to schools into organic production to reduce the exposure of pesticides to children. Driscoll's has refused to comply with this. They keep saying, oh, we're going to in the future, but it's not happening. And they claim that because they deal with contract growers, it's the responsibility of the contract growers, and it's not their responsibility. So these negative externalities on public health, these can be really complicated situations. And there's this question of who should pay for it and who should take control. Should the government take control and come up with some kind of regulation to protect schools? Or should the companies take responsibility and do the right thing? But the end point is that the people who bear the brunt of these externalities are generally the public. They are not the businesses. And if businesses do not have incentives to do better, they probably won't. So let's do our last pause and reflect question. Go ahead and pause and answer this in your notes. Whose health do the negative externalities of agriculture affect? And why do you think it's, or who do you think is most impacted? And who do you think is the least impacted? Okay, and I will leave you here. This all kind of ties into next week, which I'm excited about next week's topic, and it will be about alternative economies and thinking about designing an economy for the future that is predicated on maximizing social, environmental, and human health and well-being. So how do we design an economy that is not just based on profit and GDP, but is actually based on welfare and happiness? Like I mentioned, I think in one of my first lectures, economies are created by people. Don't ever forget that we create the economy. It's not a fact of nature, and the way that we operate it now is not a scientific law. It is a reflection of our worldview and our views of one another. So think about that until next week. And yeah, I'm excited to dive into all of that with you.